Okay, we are continuing with What is Saving Faith by Gordon Clark. In this video, we're going to be discussing subjective beliefs, the mental act. And we're going to be discussing part A just in this video, understanding. The model we're going to be using is from the Lord's parable of the sower that Jesus taught in several different sermons. We have the cause of faith, we have the object of faith, we have the act of faith, and then we have the effect of faith. And last time we talked about the objective beliefs, where you have declarative statements, and from declarative statements you can draw logical implications for systems, and then from those systems you particularly apply it to me and my self-interest. And so in this video we're going to be continuing with subjective believing. And I'm just going to start off reading just the first sentence from the parable of the sower, and then the first sentence from the Lord's interpretation of the parable of the sower from Matthew. A farmer went out to sow his seed, and as he was scattering the seed, some fell along the path, and the birds came and ate it up. And this is the interpretation. Listen to what the parable of the sower means. When anyone hears the message about the kingdom and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away what was sown in their heart. This is the seed sown along the path. So this is understanding. Understanding what? Understanding the objective word. So there's no such thing as thought without content. There's no such, we're not talking about soil, the soil. We are talking about the sown word in the soil, not just the soil. So we are thinking God's thoughts after him. We're thinking God's thoughts after him. Now, this understanding, Clark argues, as most theologians do, that understanding is, when we talk about the book of Genesis, is the likeness of God, the image and likeness of God. How does he get this? How do they get this? Well, let's draw from logical implications about metaphysics drawn from the axioms taught in Genesis. And so you're going to ask, well, what's metaphysics? Metaphysics, there's four main categories of philosophy. There's epistemology, which asks, what is truth? There's metaphysics, which asks, what is real, or what is it? Ethics, which asks what is right and wrong, and logic, which draws logical implications from declarative statements. And so metaphysics is going to ask those questions. What is it? It's a fundamental, it's elementary and fundamental question. And so suppose if you were an anthropologist and somebody brought an artifact and put it on your desk, you would ask, where did this come from? What's it made out of? How is it similar to, how is it like other artifacts? How is it different from other artifacts? And so that's to help identify it. You're going to ask, how is it like? How is it different? And these are just very elementary questions. One of these things is not like the other. It's elementary but fundamental. In other words, 1 + 1 is 2, very elementary, but yet if 1 + 1 wasn't 2, the entire field of mathematics would have to be scrapped, because it's the cornerstone upon which all of it stands. And so, so the book of Genesis, of course, is going to be where you go for these fundamental statements. We start off with Genesis 2:8. God formed Adam out of the dust of the earth, and he breathed into his nostrils, and Adam became a living being. He immediately breathed into Adam's nostrils. So you ask the basic metaphysical questions. Where did Adam come from? Well, he came from, in his physical body, he came from the ground, just like the other creatures, just like animals do. He's made of the same elements, the main basic carbon-based life forms. But we want to ask, how is Adam like God. That's how Adam's like the animals, we could say. Metaphysically similar to. But how is he uniquely like God? And so part of the question is to ask, how is he different from the animals? Because he's got these two parts. He's got these God-breathed image of God, and then we have the physical dust of the earth. And one of the questions you can ask is, you say, well, okay, well, why was Adam lonely in the garden? What did Eve have that animals didn't have? Okay, so one theologian said sex. Okay, he didn't have, he needed Eve for sex. Well, that's true, but this is not how Adam is similar to Eve. This is how he's different from her. As the French say, vive la difference. It's and in how we are different is how we complement each other and our different strengths. Women have the ability to have babies, and we don't have that. But that doesn't detract from us. It's a strength that she has that when we work together as a team, then we become very, very fruitful. And so it's not. We can't say that it's sex is the way that Adam is similar to Eve. It's how he's different from Eve. And also, you can't say it because God doesn't have a body. God the Father does not have a body. And also, animals have sex. So we're trying to talk about what is it that distinguishes us from the animals. We're not trying to say how is it, how are we distinguishing from each other. That's not the question. We're trying to get at what is the image of God by distinguishing ourselves from animals. So God doesn't have a physical body. So it's something not physical. And so something spiritual. Now, some people will think, well, what about who's that Eastern meditation guy, Eckhart Tolle, the consciousness. What about consciousness? Well, a problem with that is dogs. I'm not I'm not recommending him, by the way. But that dogs have consciousness. That's why you have a watchdog. That's why if you take a pointer dog out hunting, he has focus. He points, and so animals have focus and they have consciousness. And this is something that we share with animals. This isn't something that we're distinct from them. I mean, and by the way, that when you do share something with somebody, that is in the way that you commune. So men often like to hunt, and so they're going to like dogs because dogs, or at least those species of dogs that like to hunt. And, girls like to snuggle, so they will like cats because cats like to be warm and snuggle. And I'm not trying to make sweeping generalizations. I'm just trying to simply make the point that it is in those things that we have in common that we commune. Now, a peculiar thing about a hunting dog is a hunting dog complements the hunter because he has things that are different from the hunter that the hunter doesn't have. He has a superior sense of smell, superior sense of hearing, and so he can find the game. But now also the hunter obviously has the intelligence and the strategy and the tactics for hunting and the gun that the dog doesn't have. And so the two make a great team. Their differences complement each other and they make a great team. Now, but of course, we're trying to ask the question, how are we different from the animals and like God? And so if you think about, we could ask the question, you think about an eagle. An eagle can see a dime from a mile away. A shark can smell a drop of blood in the ocean from a mile away. A bat can hear the fluttering of a gnat's wings from hundreds of yards away. But you ask the question, why did Helen Keller get a master's degree? And I don't think any eagle, shark, or bat ever acquired a master's degree. And so the theologians come to you can read books on this, but they come to the conclusion that reason is this distinction that we have from the animals. There's particular verses that will exactly say that. Proverbs 30, verse 2, Psalm 73, verse 22. There's other verses that say that the ability to reason is what distinguishes us from the animals. This is the likeness. This is how we are like God. This is the part of us that's like God. And it's in this ability to reason and communicate with words was why Adam was lonely in the garden, and why Eve, that's what Eve had that the animals didn't have, that she was like him in. And this is also how man communes with God, is that we have the ability to reason, and through his word, we understand his word apprehended by reason. And so this is what the buzzards are trying to steal. Let me say that again. This is what those birds in the parable of the sower are trying to snatch away, and this is what the sophists and the tricksters and the devil is trying to take away, is this ability to understand God's word, to make it intelligible and understand it. And they have they're very tricky about it. This ability to reason and be rational. Of course, in order to understand something, it has to be comprehensible. It can't be spoken in a language that you don't understand. If somebody preaches the gospel in German and you don't speak German, well, it's going to be inimical to understanding. You cannot understand, using big words, you cannot understand something if it's not spoken in a language that you understand. So now, this is important though, because Gordon Clark doesn't. One of the things is Gordon Clark doesn't particularly talk about declarative statements. I'm just going to say this as an aside, and then I'm going to get back on course here. But he doesn't exactly talk about declarative statements. He talks about propositions, which is the meaning of the declarative statement. And so, if somebody says something in French and somebody also says it in Greek, it's the same meaning, though it might be spoken in different forms. So we're talking about the meaning of declarative statements. But I don't get into that because it just gets it gets a little too tangled. And of course, if you want to read in more detail, in Gordon Clark's book, he gets into that in more detail than any YouTuber is going to endure watching. So another way, so it has to be in a language that we understand, and it can't be a contradiction. This is one of the ways that the buzzards will do this, is that they'll mix up contradictions, the squared circles, and they'll teach that systems can have contradictions in them, and yet we can still believe them. And Gordon Clark flatly denies this. He says, Christians don't believe in contradictions because nobody can. You can't believe the cat is black and the cat is not black and hold them together in your mind and sincerely believe both of them. You can't. So we cannot believe in contradictions. But now, closely related to contradictions is nonsense. Now, it's not exactly the same as a contradiction. Nonsense is just saying something that doesn't make sense. The statement, a cat is black and the cat is not black, both of those statements make sense, but they have loggerheads with each other. Whereas nonsense just doesn't make sense. They'll say stuff, the color of orange, the sound of orange. Oh, it's so unfathomable. It's so deep. It's not profound in the sense that it's such an enormous statement that it's difficult to grasp. It's not stupendous, it's just stupid. And usually what they'll do with it is that this is the way that all the popular ones are, is they mix up categories. Of course, you have the category of sound and audible, and then you have the category of sight and visual. And so what you do is you take, something that belongs to the category of sight, and you give it an audible conclusion here. So you're mixing up these categories, and we'll definitely discuss this in more detail later on, in particularly how the modernists do this. They put things in the wrong categories. and specifically, just a foreshadow, they put things in the wrong categories of philosophy. We talked about epistemology and metaphysics, ethics and logic. They put them in the wrong categories. And it sounds like it feels like it makes sense. You know, the sound of orange, it almost feels like that makes sense. It's almost like one of those pictures where you see somebody with two noses and your mind just tries to put them together, and it feels like they make sense. Another thing is that lots of times it is valid poetry sometimes to talk that way. But what Gordon Clark says about metaphors and poetry is he says that's fine, and it can help color people's minds to understanding things. But if you can't take those metaphors and that poetry and put it into a logical, coherent statement, then you're just fooling yourself. Your mind is very deceptive. I remember in law school, I would think that I understood the principle, and then I would sit down and start writing out the brief, and then realize that I had nonsense in my head or logical contradictions in my head. And so, it's when the thought has to be rational, it has to be not nonsense, it has to be not a contradiction, and it has to be comprehensible. Okay, so now also, another very important point that Clark talks about is that, you have to be, it has to be a critical thought. You can't have, the problem with, what we want to do is we want to go through the steps of logic and reach a conclusion. And along the way of building your system, you're going to confront contradictions in your mind. And this is how sanctification happens. We are transformed by the renewing of our minds. And it's through the working through and resolving and reconciling them that our minds are renewed and we are sanctified. This is the process that God uses. His word growing up in our minds is what sanctifies us. And so now what the problem is if he talks about people who are just too pious. I mean, and also he talks about, and also there's people who are skeptical. What's the difference? Well, a skeptic is somebody who just doesn't listen because he already knows. He already knows he rejects it before reasoning it out. He doesn't go through those steps of logic, confronting and working it through. He already knows. He doesn't have to go through those things because he's already Mr. Know-it-all. Now, I'm not saying that there's a problem with coming to a conclusion. Of course, you will come to a conclusion. But after you have gone through the steps of logic, not before. And similar to the skeptic is the person who's pious, who agrees before reasoning it out. Somebody says something, there's like, yes, amen, I agree. Well, you didn't even think about it. You didn't think about it critically. If your mind is not going through these steps and asking questions and confronting in your system, wait a minute, that doesn't make sense. That's a contradiction. How does that work out? Go talk to your pastor about it. Try to figure these things out. If you're not going through that process, then you're not reaching understanding. You're just simply like the skeptic, not going through the steps of logic and reaching a conclusion without thinking. And so, this is another way that these buzzards, these birds that are snatching away the word, they can steal the word away right in your church with people who are just being too holy that they're not thinking about it. And so that's another point that Clark talks about, being too pious. And now finally, we want to talk about it. The words that you hear must be defined. And so we talked, now keep in mind, we are talking about understanding any word in general. We're not necessarily talking about defining the word faith. I'm talking about defining any word. And in order to understand any word, you have to understand it. And we're kind of like in a little bit of like when you turn two mirrors on each other, you kind of see the reflecting of the reflection. But we're talking about defining any word. And you can remember, we talked about it, you could either be too broad in your definition, eagles are all animals, you know, or too narrow in your definition. And so this is one of the things that happens. If you remember from Animal Farm, you know, they had that all animals are equal. Some animals are more equal than others. The word starts to meander. They start to change the meaning. Well, that's not the meaning of the word equal. Well, yeah, so they start to add things to the meaning, make it broader than the original meaning. And this is how you will always see a subversive philosophy coming down the road, is that they will start to define the words in a different way than what is defined in Scripture. And so this is just the first part A of subjective believing, is the understanding. And we have to avoid, or it has to be the argument that it's in the likeness of God, that is the likeness of God, and that it's rational, comprehensible, you have to be critical in your thought, and it has to be defined. And next time we're going to continue with part B, assent. And we'll talk to you then.